say is that classical texts ask too much for the beginning readers. They were not written for people coming from another cultural milieu. Rather, they were written for people who thought more or less the same way the authors did and who shared the same worldview. It's very dangerous to read a book by Imam al-Ghazali and not understand that Imam al-Ghazali is working in 6th century Eastern Islam. And if you attempt to apply your standards or your criterions to the Imam, you're doing him a grave disservice because it's simply not fair. On the other hand, his tradition, the Imam's tradition, definitely says something to us today. Imam al-Ghazali is as relevant today for us as he was when he was writing, because he's writing about universals. On the other hand, there are going to be things in Imam al-Ghazali's book that are not relevant today, because they relate to his time and place. Another thing that he says, as a general rule, they were written for those with advanced intellectual training, a type of training that is seldom offered in our graduate schools, much less on the undergraduate level. Now, anybody who's worked in traditional Islamic texts, one of the things about, for instance, Imam al-Ghazali, he assumes in most of his works, not in all of them, because he wrote some of them as popular works, in most of his works, he is assuming that you have been trained in grammar, in rhetoric, in logic, dialectic. He's assuming that you've been trained in poetry, in prosody. He's assuming you've been trained in mathematics. He's making these assumptions when he writes his book. And so you will find things that even if you know Arabic, if you don't know logic, you don't realize that he's actually using terms that don't mean what they mean to the average Arabic reader. They actually mean something. It's a technical word. It's a technical term. To study in classical texts, one has to go through a classical training. And if you don't, you're just not able to do it. And that's why you will see gross mistranslations of classical texts. Gross mistranslations, because people don't know the requisite knowledges that are needed to examine the text. Now, one of the things they mention also is that the texts were basically outlines of an argument. Anybody who studied any of our classes with any of these traditional texts, that's what you'll note. You're dealing with an outline. Texts tended to be pegs upon which the teacher hung the meanings or the commentary. That was how the traditional Muslim world transmitted knowledge. When you learned the Alfiya, it wasn't enough just to know those lines of poetry. You had to know the commentary. You had to know all of the examples in order for the rules to become meaningful. So another thing is that the students did not borrow the books from the library and then return them the following week. They didn't buy them at the local. They had to copy them out by hand and spend several months or years studying it word by word with a master. Now, I personally did copy out some of the texts that I wrote because they weren't published, they weren't available. And there's a great benefit in doing that. And I'm glad I had that opportunity. And then I would sit and word for word, the Shaykh would comment on the text. Having the opportunity, having studied dozens of books like that with teachers has been immense. Shaykh Muhammad, on the other hand, has studied hundreds of books. He studied, I think, 400 books with his father. A lot of them were reading them, but many of them were word for word commentaries on these texts. Generally, if you had a good training, you would have studied at least 30 or 40 books well before a teacher would let you move on your own and be able to study from the text.